podcast name and logo. What should I call my podcast? These are fun. I like naming people's podcasts. I can come up with some pretty crazy ones. I think Talking with Tarashuk came up with. I was on the phone with Jared, and I had the opportunity to interview Dr. Phil Riccobono, who was the first guest for the Talking with Tarashuk podcast. And at that time, I was doing the Ambiguous Podcast Solutions, which is the podcast where I or a member of the APS team interviews other podcasters to talk about their podcast and, what they're looking for, what they do, what their podcast is about. It's a networking tool, yada, yada, yada. And I was like, Jared, this guy doesn't have a podcast. Can I just put on that feed? And he was like, no, because that's not what the podcast is about. And I'm just like, well, I guess I'll just create another one. I'll call it Talking with Tarashuk. I don't know. And that's literally how it came about. I kid you not. That is exactly how I got the name for Talking with Tarashuk. Bottom line, don't overthink this. Your podcast name should have something to do with what you're talking about. Duh. It should have a meaning and story behind it. For example, I'm very proud of this example I wrote up on the top of my head. If you have a podcast about comic books, you can call it the Kapow Podcast. You're like, Kapow! So, the story, stereotypical Kapow, used in comic books when someone gets hit. It's short, sweet, and it's relatable.
I think Bam Wham Zam's better.
Bam Wham Zam? That's another one. That's a good one, too. Bam Wham Zam. Now, as when I wrote this like a year and a half ago, maybe a little short, maybe not as long as that, I Googled it. That podcast did not exist. If it still exists, take it. You're welcome. It's yours. The Kapow Podcast, talking all about comic books. But you get the point. Short, sweet, it's relatable. Talking with Tarashuk, I'm Will Tarashuk, you talk with me. Typically, things to avoid. Don't just use your name. Don't call your podcast the Greg Skinner Show. Sorry, Greg. No one knows who you are. And as of the first episode, no one really cares. Apologies to all the Greg Skinners out there.
Where did you get this name?
I just made it up. I made it. It's in my head with Michael Looper. The only with two P's.
You have ERs in all of your names.
Yep. The only exception for this is if you're famous or if you're well known in the industry. Jon Stewart has a podcast called The Problem with Jon Stewart, which makes sense because Jon Stewart is a celebrity.
Jon Stewart is Jon Stewart.
Jon Stewart's Jon Stewart, right? The name says itself, right? Like a Joe Rogan Experience. When he first started, he was the Fear Factor guy and the comedian. It's famous enough. If Logan Paul did the Logan Paul podcast, even though he has impulsive, silly, but it works. Talking to Tarashuk's a little different, in my opinion, because it's my last name. It's not my first name. It's not like Talking with Will Tarashuk. Talking with Tarashuk kind of rolls off the tongue. So maybe a little hypocritical, but I think it's a little different. The one exception to that is if the name is already taken, you could still use it. So, for example, if you have like a relationship podcast, like Boyfriend, Girlfriend, and you want to talk about breakups and how to deal with breakups, you call it the Breakup Podcast. Most likely that's taken, but the Breakup Podcast with Will Tarashuk will definitely be available. And as long as the logo looks a little bit different or looks different enough, you don't use the same color scheme, you should be just fine.
And that's the exception.
That's the exception. Now, there's also an exception to that exception, which is an exception to the other exception. That will not work if the name is already trademarked. So, for example, you cannot do the Coca-Cola podcast with Will Tarashuk because Coke is trademarked. It's a trademarked product.
It's very trademarked.
Right? You get sued really quick. So, don't do that.